Hi everyone, Nicole Littman with Aurelian Coaching. Thanks for joining today. We are talking about creativity, and this is going to be such a fun session. The whole point of this session is to demystify the creative process. I think what a lot of people believe is that creativity is either something you have or you don't. That it's a talent that's innate and you're born with it. And I want to completely demystify that. And the reason is because I think we need to be more creative in the workplace. Creativity is something that is always valued, right? You hear about this, innovative solutions to business problems, or, when somebody comes up with something creative, a lot of times the response is, wow, how did you come up with that? If you guys have creatives in your life, like writers or designers, a lot of times they get asked, and a lot of times they talk about their creative process, right? Have you heard of this? We could totally demystify this. Creativity is what happens in the brain. There are a series of steps that the brain takes to generate a new idea. And that's what I want to talk about today. For people who you might think of as naturally creative, for them, the experience may be instantaneous, right? But believe me, what's happening in their brain, they're still going through a series of steps to generate something that manifests into a creative thing, okay? So I want to demystify some of our assumptions around creativity. I am going to be presenting a model that I created. Super simple, 4 steps, and it's a creativity loop, I call it. So I'll walk you through that, and then I have tons of examples that I want to share with you guys and show you how easy it is. And like any skill that we review week in and week out, this is something that can be practiced, right? And you can practice it in very small situations, 30 seconds here and 30 seconds there. And the more you practice it, the more it becomes second nature. And, somebody might eventually say about you how innately talented and creative you are. The reason I want us to practice creativity is, like a lot of things that we've talked about week in and week out, when you practice something, when it comes time for it to really matter, when you need to be creative at work, it's going to be a lot easier. It's going to be a lot easier to go through that exercise. And I also want people to kind of take on the identity of being a creative person. So this is something, it has huge impact on your work life, and I'll even tell you some stories about how I've interacted with my kid on this model. So the first thing I want to do is where I often start with these live videos is with a definition. So I disagree with a lot of the definitions about creativity out there that just talk about this sort of mysterious process of imagination. Sure, things come from the imagination, but what is that? I read a beautiful definition of creativity that I want to share with you that I believe is true for anything that we think about as a creative endeavor, and even the things that traditionally are not. And that definition is that creativity is nothing but the process of making a connection between two seemingly disparate things. So things that don't appear to have any relation to one another, when you can draw parallels and create bridges between those two things, that's creative. That's creativity. So people who are naturally creative, these are the connections that they're making in their head and producing something from it. So why can't we break down that process and apply it to everyday life and especially our jobs? So the model that I created, it's a creativity loop model. You can find it on the website aureliancoaching.com. If you go to the blog section, I have a screenshot of the model there. And it's just 4 steps, and the last step leads into the first step again, so you can keep going, and it can feed on whatever you were previously doing. So the first step is to create a linkage, right? So you have to identify 2 things that just don't seem very related to one another. And you're going to say, okay, I'm going to find some way to connect those things. So the second step is to draw parallels between those 2 things. Now this can manifest in a couple of different ways. The easiest way, when I walk through this process with my 5-year-old, the easiest way she does it is she tries to identify things that are the same between those 2 things that seem totally different. She'll think about it and think of something that might be the same between them. Another way of doing this is to create a bridge, right? So there is definitely some separation between those 2 things, but can you create a ladder from one to another in terms of the qualities, the circumstances, functionality, I don't know, anything to draw some connections between those 2 things. Okay, once you have some connection, linkage, parallel, similarity, whatever it is, the third piece is to ask yourself, how can I leverage that? And what I mean by leverage is, does that parallel, does that linkage have any sort of utility, or is it interesting in any way, right? Then the fourth step is to acknowledge that there might be some limitations or restrictions, and those are fine. Those are fine, right? That's a part of the process. There are going to be some things that are a little wonky about that linkage that you just created, and it's important to acknowledge those limitations. Now, what you do with those limitations can vary, right? So you can take the limitation and say, and just accept it and say, okay, well, that's a limitation of this, but it doesn't invalidate the linkage that you created. Another thing that you can do is acknowledge that limitation, but then go back through the loop and say, can I create a new linkage? Or does that limitation prompt an idea about another disparate point that might work better, right? So you can go through the process again. Now, this is a very, very important point in this model. When we go through this exercise, it is human nature to just stop and to acknowledge all of the limitations and restrictions way too early in the process, okay? And if there's one thing that traditionally creative people do that maybe the non-creatives don't do, is that they don't put the or acknowledge the limitations too early in the process, right? So when you're looking at 2 very different things, your brain is going to want to say, that's crazy. Those things have nothing to do with each other, right? That's absurd. Your brain is going to want to stop this process. And what I really encourage you to do is go through the exercise. Go ahead and draw those parallels, and then, really important, before you acknowledge limitations, first go through the step of identifying utility, interest. Is there anything there that is useful? Can I leverage that parallel somehow before you start talking about all the things wrong with this idea? Okay, so that's a very important piece to this. There are probably some wonderful connections that have been made, but they don't even have the chance to realize their potential because we give in to that tendency, that knee-jerk reaction to say, no, that won't work. That's crazy. Don't do that. Okay, when you go through the model, go through the whole model in order. Okay, so I have some examples because all of this is abstract, right? So at the dinner table, I did this exercise with my daughter, who's 5. And we played this little game, and this was a few nights ago. And so we picked a couple of things that we could see in our field of vision, right? And so the first thing that the first exercise we went through is she picked the coffee maker and a backpack. Like, what, those things have nothing to do with one another, right? And we started thinking, well, how are those things used? How can they be used together, right? And I started thinking about when I was in college, all my 8 a.m. labs where you would basically have to roll out of bed, right? Put something on and get to that early morning lab on time. And then you would be there for like 3 hours. And yeah, I mean, I thought about, do I really want to spend whatever it was? Back then it was like $3 or $4 on coffee. Now it's $5 or $6 on a coffee, right? And also you have to wait in line to get it, right? But even if you made coffee at home, you'd have to wait for the coffee to brew. And sometimes, I mean, come on, guys, literally in college, you just like got up out of bed, grabbed your backpack and left, right? Sometimes it was like that. So could there be a way to have like a portable brewer that you could tuck in your backpack, flip on a switch, and have the coffee brewing as you headed to class? Maybe this already exists, I don't know, right? But it was a fun exercise, right? Another one that my daughter came up with was she looked at, we have a little food scale. And it's just this little thing from Amazon. It was like $10 from Amazon. And it's just a tiny little round thing. And then there was a vase of flowers, like fake flowers, right? And so she picked those two things. And I said, okay, well, how can we combine those two things? And she said, well, we could make the food scale in a way that it would hold the flowers, and then we could put it in the middle of the table and make, I mean, she didn't use the word centerpiece, but that's what she meant. Like, oh, we could put flowers around the little food scale, and the food scale can measure the food. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is brilliant, right? Think about it. We grew up in a Filipino household where everybody's eating family style, right? So we don't have these kind of preset, prepared plates, right? It's just everything's on the table, right? And people grab whatever they want, right? Really hard for portion control, right? So I thought, this is so brilliant, right? If you could have a food scale, right, that would act as a centerpiece. You could put you could put the plate on there and then kind of measure out your food, and then it would look nice and it doesn't look like a food scale. We had so much fun with this. And hey, you guys are welcome to take these ideas and run with it, make your millions, whatever it is. But come on, guys, this is the whole process. Somebody can come up with this, make their millions, and people are like, how would anybody think of that? This is the way. This is the way that the brain generates. When you think about imagination, that's all it is. It's making connections between two disparate things, right? Drawing parallels, right? Saying, how can I use this? How can I leverage this? And then if there are limitations, addressing the limitations, right? Not that complicated, right? You could do it for tons of things. And there's so many examples of this already, right? Think about the smartphone. Talk about disparate items, right? Who would have thought, certainly when I was growing up, the TV and the telephone had nothing to do with one another. Like, right? But somebody said, I wonder if we can create some sort of bridge between a telephone and a TV. What do they have in common? How do they operate? How do they function? Whatever. Somebody's doing this, right? And then they folded in, games, right? Somebody looked at their Atari game and said, wow, I'm dating myself. Somebody looked at their handheld game and said, oh, I wonder if we can fold this in, right? A camcorder, video. And all of that stuff is now in all of our smartphones, right? Okay, so there are tons of examples in the workplace, and this is something where it may not feel as obvious, but that's the whole point. We are going to practice this, right? So at least in my line of work, I did a lot of policy work, right? And the policy work, Hey, Damien. So the policy work is one that's really interesting because the way people were creative in implementing policy or creating new policy was to look at things in totally different arenas and just asking ourselves, can we apply something in a totally different area to what we're trying to accomplish, right? Two very disparate things. How can we build a bridge? How can we create a parallel? Is it going to have utility for us? If yes, let's go for it, right? And so we did that a lot with policy, where we would take something that was working really, really well in one area, and we just picked another area. We just looked at an entirely different setting. We looked at completely different agencies, and we said, what are they doing over there? And can we apply it to what we're trying to accomplish? Okay, it's the same process every single time. Okay, a lot of the technologies I worked with were medical technologies, right? Innovations in devices and laboratory diagnostics and all this stuff. And all of these innovations were built upon somebody saying, look at these two things, totally unrelated, but is there some way that we could connect them, draw a parallel? I mean, we did stuff in stroke care where the question was, how do we move the needle on stroke outcomes, right? We've been doing the same stuff in stroke and, year after year after year. And the question was that the outcomes aren't getting that much better. We looked in an entirely different arena. We looked at transplant and transplant outcomes are fantastic, right? Compared to what they used to be. What did they do, right? Transplant, stroke, they're different, totally different. But when you think about how to build a really good stroke program, look elsewhere and see what else is happening and how you might be able to leverage those connections and all of those bridges that you can make. So definitely practice this. Hi, Nick. Thanks. Very valuable insights, he says. I'm glad it's useful, but it's so simple. It's so simple. Remember, number one, creativity is not just something that you are born with. It is absolutely something that can be cultivated, it can be fostered, it can be mastered. You can be a creative master. Number two, it's not hard. Not hard. The process that happens in the brain, all you need to do is break it down and just mindfully go through each of those steps, right? My 5-year-old does it. She came up with a couple great ideas that are going to help people. I don't know, but it's a fun game to do, right? But it's not hard, right? And if it's something that feels, especially when we're in the workplace and there is a very complicated problem, or it feels like such a heavy problem to solve, that's okay. Try this creativity loop model with other smaller things that don't feel so heavy. See what you come up with. Do it with other people. Oh, that should be fun, right? Do it with your team. Roll out the creativity loop model with your team on something unrelated to kind of get people used to it. See how other people's mind works. That's super interesting, right? Everybody is going to come up with different bridges, different linkages, different parallels, and different ideas about the utility of those linkages. So it's a beautiful process. Have a lot of fun with it. If you are part of the Skill Masters group, you are going to get a tool tomorrow that will walk you through this, that you can roll out with your team. So if you're not already a part of Skill Masters and you want to join, you can just go to aureliancoaching.com, sign up there, put in your email address, and you will get that very next email. It's all free. Okay, so next week we are going to be talking about a work-life balance issue. So this comes as a request from a colleague of mine, somebody that I have coached, and she was struggling with this question of how to transition from work to home. She has a very, very high stress job, and it's a job that she's very good at, she loves, she gets satisfaction out of, but she still doesn't want to take the work home. So how do you transition? I have got the solution to this. It works, but it's not what you think it might be. Okay, so tune in for that next week. Aureliancoaching.com if you want to sign up for Skill Masters. Other than that, have a great rest of the week, and I will talk to you guys same time, same place next week. Bye.